So hello, and welcome to Section 2 of our course, Foundations of Political Thought. Before we move on to questions of virtue and happiness, I want to take a minute to get some closure on the question of political authority that we addressed in Section 1. The readings and the slides raise some fairly tough problems for social contract theories that are grounded in consent, and those less voluntaristic theories that are grounded in ideas of reciprocity or fair play. The question remains, though, is that the end of the story? Should we all be anarchists now? Should we only obey the law when we ultimately feel like obeying the law? I'm going to suggest 4 possible strategies that, when taken together, seem to lessen some of our worries about political authority. I want to take a minute to note that, although I think they lessen our worries about political authority, I don't think they lessen our worries about political coercion, but that's a story for another day. The first of these strategies is to note that the lack of political authority isn't always threatening. The second is that it's plausible to think that we have natural duties to not be threats to one another, and that has implications about what our obligations are. The third is that reciprocity can give us some, though not all, of our political obligations. And the fourth one is that many of us would consent if we were asked to do so. And for those people, political authority seems fairly well cemented, or at least less problematic. So together, these considerations don't solve all our problems or answer all of our questions about our political duties, but they should lessen the existential worries that Huemer and Simmons have raised. The fact that reciprocity doesn't get us all the way, and consent doesn't get us all the way, does not yet prove that everything is now morally permitted. Okay, let's go through these in order. First, not having political obligations may not be all that threatening. Now, I stress the word political here. As long as we can defend lots of non-political obligations, we should be okay. So, murdering, stealing, raping, blackmailing, extorting, and fraud are all wrong regardless of what the government says on the subject. Not having political obligations, not do these things, doesn't change our obligations. Ultimately, the worry is that if we don't have political obligations to refrain from doing these things, that we will live in a sort of anarchic, anything goes, Mad Max kind of society. But what keeps the peace in the street is not the existence of political obligations. It's a mix of governmental threats of coercion and deeply embedded social norms about ultimately what's appropriate to do to one another in a given time and place. What the government can do is help settle common expectations about what we are obligated to do. They can write down laws that specify what's going to legally count as fraud or legally count as a murder versus what's not. And that, writing those things down and publicizing those rules, helps us orient our own behavior so that we can know in advance when we're going to be punished or when our behavior is going to lead us to being punished. But what it's not going to do is tell us whether our behavior is right or wrong. It'll only tell us what the consequences of engaging in one type of behavior versus another is going to be. Now, that's a valuable benefit. Knowing how one's behavior is going to be treated in a group of people is a valuable benefit. And when the government performs that service, it's probably one that we should pay for. Second, it's plausible to think that we have duties to participate in schemes that help us avoid being threats to one another, and schemes that ultimately help keep the peace. I think traffic laws are like this, and I think property and commercial law can be treated like this as well. The reason you have no right to build a mini military arsenal complex on your property is in part because regardless of what you say about what your intentions are, your firepower does pose a threat to other people around you that no considerations of self-defense can override, because ultimately your possession of that firepower puts them at a power disadvantage. It means that you could, if you wanted to, do them a lot of harm, right? And it's not clear that you have a right to be a threat like that to other people. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a little bit of a threat. Every time you drive a car, you're a little bit of a threat, and their very existence poses a little bit of a threat, I suppose. But those considerations can be overridden by other, more important moral considerations. So, for instance, you're owning a firearm certainly poses a threat to other people, but that threat can be overridden by other types of moral considerations, for instance, ideas about self-defense. If you do think that it's a natural duty not to be too great a threat to the people around you, then obedience to a lot of otherwise seemingly arbitrary laws, like traffic laws, again, can be justified because they play a role in keeping people safe from one another and preserving the peace. And again, if you don't think that you have a right to threaten people, then it seems like you should endorse the types of rules that help us not be threats to one another. The third reason is one that we've gone over a little bit, and that's the idea of reciprocity. Now, I don't think reciprocity and fair play can obligate us to do whatever the government says. But I do think that it can obligate us to pay for the public services we do in fact use. And it can obligate us to participate in the schemes the government puts in place to deal with those social problems we agree something ought to be done about. That is to say, those things that you do use and you do agree for, I think reciprocity can obligate you to pay for. So if you ever plan on using unemployment insurance or collecting Social Security, it seems like you do have an obligation to pay into the system. And if you don't want to be ruled by the Russians or the Chinese, you should probably pay for national defense services. If you want to be able to transact safely with other private parties, then you're probably obligated to pay for everything that makes that possible. Now, if you're a business person, then you should pay for your accountant and your lawyer, and you do that out of pocket. But of course, court services that stand in the background, whether you use them or not, law enforcement that stands in the background, whether you need them or not, are also the sorts of things that make it possible for you to transact peacefully. And so again, it seems like reciprocity might obligate you to pay for them, as long as you do in fact agree or want to engage in any sort of trade. The fourth and the final reason is, again, one that we looked at a little bit, and that's the idea of consent. Now, not everyone consents to everything the government does. Certainly not by remaining in your country of birth. We saw the problems with residence. Certainly not by voting. We saw the problems with that. But it's still true that some of us, by continuing to reside, and some of us, by voting or participating in other ways, do in fact consent. And we believe that we do. Some of us can in fact leave if we don't like it, but not all of us. So, all of this doesn't justify coercion. It doesn't justify incarceration and prosecution of people who do in fact have a serious problem with the way the federal government runs its business. So it doesn't solve the hard problems, but it does solve the easy problems, the everyday problems, and that's already something. So I think on the question of consent, I think it's probably true that the government could do more. I think that, for instance, by giving us more alternatives, so for instance through federalism, by allowing different subnational jurisdictions to have different sorts of laws, that can enable us to choose between a wider range of governmental services and governmental impositions. If you want high taxes and lots of government services, then Massachusetts is a great place to be. If you would like low taxes and low government services, then perhaps South Dakota is a good place to be. The government, in other words, could perhaps enhance its authority by giving us fewer reasons to complain by allowing more options. Again, it's just a suggestion. But these four considerations together, I think, can leave us somewhat comforted that much of the time, most of the people are obligated to obey at least the common sense laws. As I said, let me just go over them real quick, right? Political authority is not the lack of political authority isn't always threatening. We don't always have a duty. In fact, we probably never have a duty to be a threat to other people, or we have a duty not to be a threat to other people. Let's be more specific, right? You don't have a right to be a threat to people. Reciprocity can probably get us some political obligations, and consent can probably get us some other political obligations. So all those things together seems to suggest that for a lot of people, a lot of the time, political authority is pretty well cemented. Now, I think there are still some problems, right? There's some gaps. There are people who would prefer some other way of life, right? Anarchists or hermits, or simply perhaps religiously devout sects of people who wish to practice their faith away from government and the rest of society. There are also minorities who are systematically deprived of basic rights and opportunities. And of course, there's always going to be in the United States the problem of Native Americans whose lands have been taken to build this country. But taken together, these people perhaps are not a very large fraction of the population. So their fate matters. These problems are important, particularly to them. But the problem isn't nearly so large as Simmons and Humer want us to think. Right? So the fact that everything is not justified by consent and reciprocity doesn't mean that some things might not be justified by consent and reciprocity. What all this does mean in the end of the day, though, is that there's, again, as I mentioned in my previous video, there's going to be a certain loss of innocence with respect to the law and government. It's pretty clear that the fact that something is a law doesn't really tell us anything much yet about whether we have a moral obligation to obey it. The burden of making a decision in a judgment call is ultimately on us. What we can't do is bury our heads in the sand and rely on the law to tell us what to do. Because the mere fact that it's the law doesn't settle the question of what we're morally obligated to do. It only settles the question of what the potential penalties are if we don't do it. Okay. With that in place, let's turn to section 2 of the class on happiness and virtue. So ever since Plato and Aristotle, and probably a lot earlier than that, individuals have wondered what it is that government ultimately is supposed to do. Let's assume that the problems of section 1 are mostly solved. Let's assume that a government has some authority. Question then presents itself: what should it do with that authority? What goals should it promote? What values should it defend? What rights and privileges should it honor? Section 2 examines two important goals that people have thought the government should promote: happiness and virtue. In other words, when asked what government should do, people often say, make us better people, make us greater people, perhaps even make us a great people, or help us pursue or help us achieve happiness. These seem to be two deeply ingrained ideas about what the government should do. Now, it's well understood that both these things, happiness and virtue, are difficult to achieve on our own, in our corner somewhere. Being a good person doesn't come easily. We have many incentives to be selfish or indifferent, and even petty and cruel, and even more so when nobody else is looking over our shoulder. Many have thought that government could help put us on the right track, if only by looking over our shoulder. Plato and Aristotle tended to see government as a kind of therapist, or maybe today, a life coach, nudging you towards the good life, the right sort of life. The government shouldn't be overbearing enough to take decisions away from you. You can explore that question in my other video on freedom and virtue. But it can't be so indifferent either as to be neutral on questions of virtue. Plato and Aristotle noted very early on that no matter what the government does, it's taking a side. Even if the government is not taking a side, that's taking a side. There's no such thing as a non-moral stance. All stances the government takes is a moral stance, or are moral stances. It's just even not taking a stance is a moral stance about neutrality and the moral value of neutrality. Being happy is also something that most of us can't do by ourselves, just like being virtuous. It requires the cooperation of others, both in helping us achieve what Aristotle called internal goods, like peace of mind, and external goods, like health or wealth. Later on, utilitarians like Bentham or Mill became more skeptical that governments were very likely to make us happy or virtuous. Now, they still thought, Bentham and Mill as utilitarians thought the purpose of government was to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. There's no question about that. But they were all pretty pessimistic overall about the ability of governments to do much to help us directly in that quest. Now, of course, the fact that we posit some goal that government should pursue, whether it be virtue or happiness or something else, doesn't remove conflicts about what counts as virtue or happiness. Right? So the ancients thought that magnificence was a virtue. Christians, on the other hand, emphasize humility. These things tend to be intentional with one another. Aristotle thought happiness was eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a Greek word, means having a good demon, but ultimately it translates to having a kind of harmony with the community. Some people translate it as happiness, but it's happiness in a very specific and non-modern sense of the word happiness. Bentham thought happiness was simply adding up subjective pleasures and subtracting subjective pain. So some net amount of pleasure and pain, maximizing the amount of pleasure, was ultimately what happiness is. Machiavelli introduces a further complication for us, as though things weren't difficult enough. He wonders whether the virtue of the common person is the same as the virtue of the statesman. Right? Machiavelli is often cast as an amoralist, and we'll have a chance to talk about that later on when we address his writings. But at the very least, we can wonder whether the statesman should be held to the same standards as the individual, or the ordinary individual, whereas morality might be contextual. Right? The context of interstate relations is different from the context of interpersonal relations, and as a result, maybe different rules and different kinds of standards ought to apply. More recently, liberals, and including Mill and Bentham, who we just mentioned, disagree with that entirely. They think that ultimately there's one standard, and maybe the standard gets applied differently in different situations, but ultimately there's only one standard. Again, these are the sorts of issues that we're going to wrestle in Section 2 of the course.